Well, welcome everybody to Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. My name is Lawrence Diggs. I will be your host today and sometimes inquisitor to ask questions about various things. Today we're going to be talking about the humanities, but I want to first talk to you about kind of what we're going to be doing today. As we have in the past, for those of you who have been with us in the past, we are centered around trying to get conversation started. My guest and I will be having a conversation. Oh, somebody's got their mic on. We will be having a conversation, but the real conversation we want to have is between the rest of you and between each other, between the guest, between myself. You know, that's really the human connection. It's not just passive listening, but if you engage, if you have questions, if you have another point of view, if you have experiences that you think will lend to the conversation, that's what this golden hour is about. It's your opportunity to engage with other human beings in a respectful manner and test out things. You know, a lot of people believe in common sense. I'm a detractor because I think you need to stress test all your ideas. And that's when it really becomes a thing. Unstressed ideas are just kind of like, you know, they're floating out there and there are millions of them and they kind of mostly are useless. But that's how we put stress on, that's why we put stress on ideas, is to say, well, okay, this looks true, but, you know, how about this point of view? How does it look with this background? And in the process, you learn to look at a thing in many different ways. So that's what we try to accomplish here on Brainstorming the Human Connection. We will be asking these questions to you, or we'll leave these questions for you to be pondering while we're talking about various things. The first question is, how do the humanities help us to imagine the future? Another one is, why is it important to learn about other cultures and languages? And are we losing our humanity? You know, lots of things are happening, you know, bots and you know, are coming into our conversations. We have lots of soft barriers between humans, things to distract us from interacting with each other, for example. And another question would be, what impact is technology having on our ability to connect to human beings? So those are questions, you know, if you're thinking about those questions as we have this conversation, they may help you to really engage. And we'll try to come back and get you into the conversation a little later. My guest today is Lynn Sargeant, and she's the Dean of Arts, Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at South Dakota State University. Welcome, Lynn.
Great to be here.
Thanks. Let's start off by giving us the thumbnail elevator speech of Lynn. Who is this Wonder Woman?
Sure. So currently I serve as the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at SDSU. I've been here 5 years. I am by training a Russian historian. I'm specifically historian of the 19th and early 20th century. And so come out of the background of being a humanist. Historians are a little particular sometimes. Sometimes we want to be humanists. Sometimes we want to be social scientists. Sometimes we insist that we're just separate and different from everybody else. But I do believe, because we're a very literary discipline, we're fundamentally a humanistic discipline. And of course, one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is trying to understand cultures different from our own, or times different from our own, and really come to grips with how people made decisions and lived their lives. And sometimes that gives us insight for today. Sometimes it just helps us better to understand the complexity of human life.
Yes. You know,
I will say I grew up in North Dakota, and I have a lot of family in North Dakota and Minnesota, but I spent about 15 years in California in the Cal State University system.
oh, okay, we might be related.
See?
Uh, let's talk a little bit about one word that you used earlier, complexity. And I would think that part of your goal is as an educator in the humanities is to try to help students get a grip on that and maybe find ways that they personally can kind of unravel those complexities. Can you talk a little bit about that journey?
Sure. Actually, I would say that complexity, maybe also ambiguity, are some of the core things that we try to help students understand. Students often come to us, haven't been trained to take standardized tests, simple questions, and we often confront them with a novel or a poem or a work of art and ask them to really dig into it and try to understand the layers, the context, the person who created that, their own personal context, how that shaped the work, how other works of art or other works of literature or other languages shaped it. And students really struggle with that. We toss around this term critical thinking kind of casually sometimes, but it is a very difficult skill for students to learn, and they need a lot of practice. They need to try things out. They need to get it wrong sometimes, and not be afraid to get it wrong. But if they master that skill, if they become comfortable dealing with complexity, if they become comfortable dealing with ambiguity, that's something that serves them well for their whole entire life. They can parse out a newspaper article and understand the point of view, understand why it's written the way it is, the tone, the language being used, and that's just a powerful skill for living your life, not just for your college degree.
Right. And that's one of the interesting things I find that people miss, and maybe you can address some of this, is they don't really understand the value of college. For example, people will say, oh, they could go to trade school. Well, yeah, if you just plug and play for a job, but and unless the trade schools then teach you critical thinking, because if you know how to make a bomb, but you don't know why you shouldn't, that's not necessarily a good thing. So can you talk a little bit about the value of critical thinking?
Absolutely. And I think, the national conversation about education and especially higher education has really turned toward this idea that it should be sort of vocational in nature, that you go and you get a degree that has a name on it and you go and become that kind of person, right? An engineer or a pharmacist, and there's a place for that. But the students who pursue the humanities either for their degree or simply are taking some of our classes as part of their general education, when they begin to develop mastery of critical thinking, not only do they deepen their understanding of their own specific area that they're studying, if they're not one of our majors, but they also become able to draw on many other fields and disciplines, analyze them, synthesize information, and then actually present a persuasive argument. And I think that's one of the things people do forget, that one of the things with critical thinking, if you master it, you have an ability to, in some ways, advocate for your position coherently, persuasively to your colleagues, to your supervisor, to members of a team, to your spouse or partner, and engage them in dialogue, right? So it's a level of interpersonal communication, as well as an ability to decode language, to decode people's interactions and artifacts in order to come to an understanding that's much deeper than a sort of superficial reading of a text or a couple of human interactions. So if we don't teach critical thinking, you do run the risk of students graduating and they may be technically proficient at something, but they're unable to function effectively in a team or in a workplace setting because they're essentially waiting for someone to tell them what to do. And I would actually say humanities students truly excel in the ability to kind of discern their own path. Contrary to sort of folklore out there, students who graduate with a degree in the humanities do quite well. We talk not about their first job, but their third job or their, mid-career. And our favorite stories are about those students who may graduate with a degree in communications or with English. Well, they don't go on to become English. They go on to become vice presidents. They may have a passion for something and they follow that little trail all the way through their career. And they may start at, kind of an entry-level position, but they often end up as leaders both in their community and in their chosen profession. There's a reason that we see a lot of national leaders have undergraduate degrees in the humanities.
That's a very important point, too, I think that you made, and that might deserve a little bit more exploration. One is the idea of advocacy and the humanities. And one of the things I found with critical thinking, at any rate, is not only does it help you to speak better, but it helps you to listen better. And that's one of the things that we have all kinds of speeches, classes in public speaking, but none in public listening. Ever notice that? And it would just seem like that's what we need to do first, is to be able to hear what others are saying, because how can you properly respond to it? And the other thing is, we think of schools like, we'll get them prepared for the workforce. But how about the person who's going to be an entrepreneur? How about the person who's going to be a father or mother? How about the person who's going to interact with his neighbor without shooting him? All of those people, it would seem, would be kind of important. So can you speak a little bit to how the humanities and the things that you engage with helps us to make a better society overall?
Sure. And I think what you're talking about, sometimes it's reference to sort of ways of seeing or perspective taking, introducing students to this idea that, even though sometimes when we write, it becomes sort of linear, right? As a historian, you have to try to tell the story, but to remember that all of the people who are participating saw things differently, had different information, and beginning to appreciate that your own perspective is not the only perspective. I think that's one of the things that leads to what you're talking about, where people are then able, even they can disagree civilly, and they can interact with people who are having a very different perspective than their own without feeling that they're giving up their own perspective. They can defend their point of view, but they can also hear someone else's point of view. And I think in addition to the things you mentioned, I think that's also what leads people to say, take a leading role in their community, to serve on the school board or the city council or volunteer in their community, because they have a genuine desire to benefit the public good, if you will, to make their communities better. And I think oftentimes that comes out of a humanistic perspective of thinking about the world kind of in a 360-degree way, rather than through a narrow perspective.
In photography, we have this thing called working the shot. And it's like when you go out to take a picture, you take the picture from as many different perspectives as you can creatively imagine. And that's one of the things that digital photography helps us do better, because we can take 1,000 pictures instead of 36. So, having people to, learn to work the shot on everything that they, every kind of idea that's introduced to them, and every situation. It may seem like at first it's going slower because you're considering more things, but what I found is that even if you should be willing to change your position if you get new information, because otherwise I think they call that dead, because live things interact with their environment, and adjust to their environment. So it seems like this idea of taking all these different perspectives can be quite useful. Can you talk to us about some of the things that help people to do that? Some of the kind of coursework and approaches and things that you teach that help people to be more familiar, take that over a 360-degree view.
Sure. So one of the things maybe I'll talk about is learning languages. So here at SDSU, we offer students the opportunity to take Spanish, French, German, and Lakota or Dakota. And we're very active in language revitalization efforts with the Lakota and Dakota languages. Learning a language forces you to learn about perspective, because as you get into it, it destabilizes your worldview. We think through language. How we describe the world around us is very much shaped by the language that we grew up with. And as you start to acquire other languages, you start to think a little differently. I remember the moment that I really realized as I was studying Russian, okay, there are some things that are just fundamentally different in our worldviews. And one was when I learned there is no word for privacy in Russian. And that explained a whole lot about the host family I was living with and our interaction. So my American view of what it meant to have privacy, and their Russian or actually Ukrainian view of why that was just like not a thing, came to a very, very real kind of clash. And I think if I would advise anyone to really, who's trying to understand the world, just even a little bit of language training goes a long way to make you understand that other people's perspectives are critically important. And one of the things that we do see, even with students who are not going to be, say, a Spanish major, but maybe they're a nursing major who wants to have just some basic fluency or basic ability to communicate in Spanish, or for that matter, they're in construction management, and they know they'll be working with staff who are native Spanish speakers. As they learn just enough so that someone else can teach them and someone else can maybe explain to them, they come to understand how any ability to communicate another language not only gives you an appreciation for those people, but it also is a way to show respect, right? Understanding, appreciation, respect. And those are the kind of things that connect us as humans, right? Where we see each other as people. And I think that's one of the most valuable things, actually, that a student learns by studying a language, however briefly or however deeply.
I would add to that it also helps you to see yourself better, because we're all in context with other people. We don't exist, and all those other people are out there, and then we're here. We're in context with them. And to your point about expanding one's ways that you think vis-a-vis languages, one of the things I learned in speaking Japanese is that they don't have a future tense.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a different kind of, and when you realize that you can't say anything in Japanese that translates to that, it gives you a certain kind of insight, not only to how Japanese think, but why am I limited in thinking the way that I do? Why do I think the way that I do? And how I might take advantage of that, how I might think, okay, suppose there is no future or past or present, and suppose the time, and now you start thinking all kinds of things about time that I wouldn't have, I wouldn't have had the pressure to think about before. And so now I have to explore that. And that opens the mind to a whole different kind of reality.
Absolutely. And it's the same thing with when students, if they're taking, say, their English 101 class or perhaps a literature class, and they come in and their exposure perhaps to fiction or nonfiction writing has been very limited. Maybe they've read young adult books in school. They've read the kind of readers in school, and now they're sort of challenged with reading a novel, a 19th century novel, for example, and they have to almost translate their own language, their native language, into something they understand. And again, it gives you a chance to go deep. And now you've introduced, as you've said, time, that, the people of today have a different perspective than people of 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Even there's also an enormous amount that connects us and shapes us, the past to the present. So, it's really a privilege when you see students start to grasp some of this, where the light bulb moment. One of my favorite ones was always to use an image, kind of an unexpected image, and just ask them, what do you see? And to see how far they could go. And one I would use, it's a very famous image that's often called Galileo's microscope. It's a very early microscope, not necessarily really Galileo's, but it's beautiful. It's functional, but it's also beautiful, almost as a work of art. And one of the questions that students finally get to is, why did they spend so much time making this beautiful?
Yes.
Microscopes today are very, very functional, technical marvels often, but they're not decorative.
They're not decorative. Yeah. Yeah. And those are some of the interesting things that I hope to get. We'll try to come back to that, because that, I think, really gets to a lot of the humanities, is finding the value of life, not just the accounting of it, but the actual value. I want to open it up now to our other esteemed panelists. If you have any questions for Dr. Sargeant, or if you have any ideas that you want to exchange, comments that you want to make, anybody? But you got a whole bunch of Lutherans today that was sitting on the front row. Okay, Sharon?
I tuned in late thanks to Lanico, I remembered. So I really don't have anything to say except thank you. I'm really enjoying what I am hearing. I couldn't agree more with the listening part and the brain functioning in a different language. And I've studied German and French and a little bit of un poquito Spanish.
It's always both like a voyage of discovery and adventure, and very humbling when you learn another language. I will confess, I am not a great student of languages. It's hard work for me. Every time, I'm starting to work on sort of refreshing my Russian, and it just brings you back to that position of sort of the humble learner, right? Where you're like, I need a guide, but I'm also excited about all the potential and opportunity that's available through this learning.
Vicky?
I had a question. Since you
I'm
spent
sorry.
12 years out here in California, I'm in California now. I'm Cal State University Northridge graduate. And I was wondering if you, let me put it this way. How is it different in South Dakota for you than it was in California? Do you find that the same sort of ideas about Californians are, I find in South Dakota that everyone has this idea about, or in South Dakota, everybody has this idea about California, and they're so off base to me. And I just wondered, how do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think what I'll do is answer it from the perspective of working with students in the humanities in particular. So I'd grown up out here in North Dakota, spent a lot of time elsewhere, 15 years in California, and then came back, to be with my family. And one of the things in California, there's just a difference in the context because there's just a much greater population density and also population diversity, right? And I don't just mean in terms of sort of racial and ethnic diversity, but geographical. It's, California, depending on where you live, even if you're in Southern California, if you're at Northridge or you're at Fullerton, it's a different experience and a different kind of cultural context. And that shaped interactions with students. Most of the students in the Cal States, they're coming from the middle class or the working class, and the Cal State is designed really to provide an opportunity for higher education for students who either come in directly or go through the community colleges and are going to end up as teachers or business people or perhaps in one of the professions. But the universities are not about doctoral education. Right? They're very much about undergraduate education and creating opportunity. And the students I worked with there were often extremely hungry to learn. Right? They really saw education as their path to the future. And it was important in that context to themselves and to their family. Many, many, many of our students, more than the majority, were the first member of their family to go to college. And so that really shaped the way they understood what higher education was, and particularly what the humanities were, that it really sort of created a new world for them. Here in South Dakota, it's a very rural state, and except for Rapid City and Sioux Falls, there's not a lot of population density, and some of our students come from very small towns, a few hundred people, and some come from Sioux Falls where more than 80 languages are spoken. So there's a different diversity there. I would say what I see is that sometimes South Dakota students, especially when they're approaching the humanities, are more reticent. They're not familiar, and they're not confident, maybe is the word, in their capability to explore some of these ideas, to really grapple with these issues of critical thinking, of ambiguity, of complexity. And they're also, I would say, maybe polite to a fault. They don't want to say anything that might upset one of their classmates. And so sometimes they play it too safe, right? And we really have to spend a lot of time, the faculty spend a lot of time trying to make sure they feel like, okay, I can be wrong. It's okay for me to just try and be wrong and say something that maybe people go, well, maybe, but have you thought about it this way? I see Josh Rudnick kind of smiling there. He's one of our faculty, so he has some lived experience of this.
Gary, you were going to say something.
Yes, I was wondering, two-part question. Do you see a change in critical thinking over the years as students basically in the last 10 years have just grown up with text messages or very short messages, and even businesses are forced to send very, very short emails so they get read? That's one question. Have you seen that transition to being less able to critically think? The second part is, has it sharpened their focus, meaning their answers when they are responding?
That's a really interesting question. Wish I was a linguist, because I think you almost need a linguist for that question, because the thing about text messaging, or for that matter, some of the social media platforms, I have two nieces who are college age or recently graduated, and they kind of remind me, emails for old people. who want to write in complete sentences and expect, a salutation. And so it's a different genre, right? Texting is a different genre, not necessarily a bastardization of something else. It's become its own thing. And I think the question in my mind is, okay, if we take it that way, then they're probably still using those critical thinking skills. They look different and they function different, and you think about like emojis that stand in for concepts and feelings and opinions. You have to be able to decode that. You have to be able to know how to fluently use those. And that requires critical thinking, but it looks different. And to people who value grammar and syntax, it comes across as kind of an affront. I think that, when you actually sit down with students, I don't know that they're less able to critically think, but I do think that they are beginning to approach that differently, from a different starting point. And that does create challenges in the classroom, for example, and it also creates challenges as we try to communicate with each other, both in public settings and in personal settings, right? It's when my nieces text me, sometimes I'm like, I really don't know what you're saying. And then I pick up the phone and call them.
Well,
Like-
to that, oh, go ahead, Gary.
Like on a 500-page report, say they read a 500-page report, do you find that to be more focused because they are used to using short messages, so they actually transmit more information to you, critically think through it? Or is it actually more of a struggle because they're not used to writing 500 words?
I would say that, that 500-word, kind of classic essay, that can be a real challenge for students today. They may not have had much practice at it. There's some just logistical or practical limitations on that. And for example, high schools, if teachers are stretched thin, it's often time working against teachers and faculty in order to assign those kind of projects. But I also think one of the other pieces that has maybe been less valued, and we have to teach more at the college level because it's maybe not coming through, is the idea that even a 500-page essay can be quite an elegant thing and can be quite elevated rather than just simply conveying information. Because I would say that they do tend to kind of try to take the straightest line through the assignment. And of course, the ones that are going to sort of really rise are the ones that, again, we're back to the complexity, the ambiguity, kind of grappling with those kind of things, not just saying, okay, here's the answer to the question. It's still, and it can still be taught, right? I'm not sure that they're really worse than students of the past. I think they're different than students of the past.
One of the things I find along those lines is that not only students, but adults older than them as well, is a lack of precision and clarity in language. It's like people almost have an aversion to being clear, or maybe they don't know really what they want to say, so they use a lot of terms and they use them incorrectly. And almost nobody uses a dictionary. It's almost like dictionaries don't exist. And so they make up their own words, and between them and their two friends, and to them, that's what that word means, and they didn't even check in with their friends to say, hey, is this what you really mean? When you say that, open that up a little bit for me. What do you mean when you say that word, right? But it's almost like it's almost reducing language to grunts. It's like, and then if I feel the same thing, we had the same experience, we can grunt together. But anything getting back to the complexity, if you have a complex subject, they can't, and I say this because I test it often, right? I test and I ask people, what do you mean by that? Or tell me what you mean by that word. Where did you get the meaning of that word? They have no idea, but they use it in a sentence. And so when people write like their short answers, I'm all for short answers. Brevity is great. But if I don't know what you're talking about at the end of your brevity, then you said nothing, you know? So, and I find people even get irritated when you ask them to say, well, what's the meaning of that word? And, you know, they feel like you're insulting them or trying to say they're stupid. You know, I don't argue that point, you know, but if, you know, it's like, what do you, you know, what are you trying to say? Because if I don't understand it, why are we having this conversation?
I think one of the things is, you know, I haven't been in the classroom for a while, but what I saw when I was teaching, one was that a lot of students feel a lot of shame about their writing. And faculty have to work really hard to get beyond that for students, to help them understand that, you know, it's a process, you're learning. The goal is to improve, start where you are and move forward. Don't be afraid to show your writing to others and to, you know, they may ask questions and they may say, what do you mean by that? Or I don't think you're using that word the correct way. But you first have to get them beyond the shame, and that's really palpable, you know. And then I think the other piece is, you know, getting students to the point where they are, you know, the opposite of shame is sometimes pride, right? And I remember working with students who had a weak grasp of the mechanics, right? And, you know, what I would always say to them was, you know, okay, that's what you're working on, and that's fine, you know, and you at some point you're going to move beyond phonetic spelling, right? But right now it's what's up here, right? Your thoughts are great, so don't throw your potential away because you're ashamed that you have a weakness here, right? Be a part of the conversation, you know, share your ideas. And I think that is critically important, not just in a classroom setting, but also in a community setting, that, you know, we really encourage people to share.
Yes. Can you open that up a little bit about sharing? Because I think at least myself, I could use a lesson in like, how is it that you draw out people? You know, what are some of the methods you use to draw out people to actually use the intelligence that they actually have, but are not accessing, you know,
Right.
because they have an aversion to putting stress on their ideas. And so they come off like they don't know anything or like they can't think. But really, it's just like, well, now that somebody's prompted you to say, well, what if? Think about that a bit and see what you think. And as you say, don't be afraid to like, you know, to get it like the unworkable answer. Let's put it that way. But what are some of the ways that you use to, you know, to draw people out?
I mean, I think the one I try to remind myself of, and I'm not always good about it because I am a academic first of all, and a person who believes in the word, and so I have a tendency to fill up silences with talk, is to ask questions and to listen, you know, to not be the first one to speak, you know, because especially when you're in a position of authority, if you are the first person to speak and you express a strong opinion, or a strong point of view, you can actually shut other people down really, really easily. You know, whereas if you say, you know, man, this is really complicated. What do you think about this? Or, you know, I kind of know what I think, but what do you think about it? And I think we don't do that enough, right? We're in a moment in time where there's a lot of emphasis on everybody sort of sharing their point of view, but not a lot of interaction. And so it's a skill that maybe we all need to work on, you know, asking questions and listening.
Wow. Lanico, you seem to have something you wanted to add.
Oh, yes, I was sitting here listening to all this, and I had a couple questions, mostly because I'm thinking about what I was doing in the classroom. But is there a future for academia?
Yeah, it's a tough time right now. You know, and certainly there's a lot of pressure on higher education. There's a lot of I think skepticism about the value of higher education. And one of the things I try to remind myself is, as a historian, is that's not the first time that's happened. It probably won't be the last time it happens. And, you know, we will go through this process and hopefully we will come out the better for it. I think one issue, frankly, one of the reasons to be on this program and to some of the ways we're approaching our more public-facing work in the humanities here at SDSU is to be a part of that future for higher education, to help people understand what it is a faculty member really does, right? You know, both in the classroom, how do they approach teaching students about really complicated and sometimes extremely painful topics? But then also, what do they do with their own particular expertise? What does their research look like? What are they writing about? How does that connect to sort of bigger questions of our society? You know, and I think sometimes in higher education, we can be very inward looking. We communicate amongst ourselves, and then people don't feel comfortable on campus coming in and engaging with events, engaging with faculty or students. And my hope is that that will be the change that comes out of this. We're going to go through a really hard time. It's painful. It's ugly in some cases. But that might be the win that comes at the end. You know, I think about, for example, we're going to bring the author David Grann to campus on April 5th. And as that project has evolved, you know, the original question was, Dr. Jason McIntyre, who's on this, came into my office and said, man, it would be great if we could do this, but I know we can't. And I said, well, why not? Right. So, you know, we got the coalition of the willing to kind of come together to figure out how to fund it, to bring him in. And then as it evolved, it also became, well, how do we do outreach to the schools? How do we put books in the hands of community members and kids in the schools? How do we connect with our tribal communities and our tribal college partners so that they're a part of this conversation? You know, so it's become more than just a narrow academic lecture and has become something which is the entire community kind of grappling with some really hard questions about history, society, identity, how we relate to each other as communities, the place of Native Americans in society in the 20th century, crime, violence, and we're all better for it when we are able to have those interactions that are not just staying on campus.
And speaking of staying on campus, can you talk a little bit about what opportunities the SDSU have had or could have to bring some version of the humanities to the general public who are maybe engaged now in, you know, taking care of families and stuff like that and can't be a full-time student? But how do we make some of the knowledge and the experiences that you have and you know about available to the general public?
Sure. So there's a number of ways, right? And so one of the things that we actually do a lot more of than people realize is direct outreach to the community. So for example, many of our language students are involved in community outreach that might be to immigrant communities, offering legal and translation services, you know, kind of consultation, while they at the same time, you know, master their own skills more deeply. We have faculty who are interested in a pretty wide range of things. For example, I have a faculty member in philosophy and religious studies who teaches data ethics, who's a filmmaker, and who's fascinated by popular culture and religion, and wrote a book on Spider-Man that he's, spoken about several places. And that's not most people's picture of, sort of the academic, if you will. We also have things like the Oakwood Journal, which brings together both students who work on it and sometimes publish in it, but a wide range of community members who see their writings come to print in Oakwood. And that's been very, very successful for many years. And those are the kind of things universities should do, right? That we need to be outward facing. But then, some of it is as simple as our faculty and our students in the community, kind of bringing the perspective of their discipline and their expertise out to the community. The other thing is what we're hoping to do more of, if people have not been on campus recently, the Humanities have a beautiful new home. The original library at South Dakota State University, Lincoln Hall, Lincoln Library, has been remodeled and reimagined as the home for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and also for the School of American and Global Studies. And then the School of English and Interdisciplinary Studies is right next door. And this building was deliberately built and remodeled to bring people together. We hope to host part of the Festival of Books. We hope to host speakers. We hope community organizations will reach out to us and say, hey, could we have an event there? You've got this really cool space. It's state of the art. It's the future of how we teach the humanities. And it's a pretty big and bold statement on the part of the university, and particularly President Barry Dunn, that the humanities have a strong place at South Dakota State University.
Good deal.
Wow.
Gorgeous.
Yeah. Other questions? Go
I
ahead,
had
Vicki.
one. What I've noticed that I never paid any attention to generational trauma, and I guess it's a new idea. So my great grandparents fled from Russia, and then the woman that wrote The Cost of Free Land, they fled. Jews Flats, I think it's called. But I think that we don't pay enough attention to that area. I know that my kids were raised here in Los Angeles, and I was raised in South Dakota. And the difference between my great grandparents and my kids and their background is unbelievable. And there's another man that's writing a book about he wrote the dirty 20s and now the dirty 30s. And I think some of the things that we do not understand is hardship and people that flee their countries. I think that's really important. And I think maybe we're not paying enough attention to it. I'm not sure how hard I stand on generational trauma. So if my great grandparents had to flee, they had a lot of trauma because they were Germans from Russia. Can I carry that within me? And is that important? And I don't know how much attention the university pays to that. I mean, I imagine your new immigrants are really out in front about that because you can almost see it in the way they act and behave, fears, different things like that. How is that part of the curriculum now for understanding people of other cultures and bringing that along through the way they raise their children? I haven't settled it in my mind yet. I'm just throwing a bunch of stuff out there.
Oh, that's a complicated question, and I'm going to offer a couple of maybe partial answers. So on the one hand, part of what you're talking about is of a sufficient depth and complexity that it's really where faculty who are interested in such questions are doing research. And there is a lot of research on issues of generational trauma and how also just from generation to generation, we share identity, the stories we tell and how we understand them. So that is an active area of scholarship in a number of disciplines. I think with regard to how that comes up in classroom settings, perhaps less frequently with, freshmen and sophomores and more often as they get much more deep into the discipline. Specifically at SDSU, I think places where it does come up is in interactions with immigrant communities, but even more than that with our Native American students and through the Wokani Initiative. When you talk about generational trauma and you're talking about South Dakota, I mean, to me, that's really the area that comes specifically to mind and is a very present, not just academic issue, but also social issue, societal issue, economic issue, and political issue, right? So I think that South Dakota State University specifically does have a responsibility to really grapple with those and to help our students and our community grapple with those kind of questions while knowing that they are very difficult, complex even concepts to deal with. And I think it does you credit to say, I'm not really sure where I am on this, right? Rather than saying, okay, I've staked out my position, because there's a lot to understand. And, I understand quite a bit about Germans from Russia because I'm a Russian historian. And, but I think a lot of people, for example, would not think about Germans from Russia as a group that might have some kind of generational trauma, right? And it opens up some different questions from talking about more recent immigrant groups or Native Americans, and it highlights the complexity of that question.
Mhm.
I think where we don't do ourselves any favors is where we don't allow students to grasp and grapple with those kind of questions where there is no answer, maybe.
I'd like
And
to
can
ask,
we,
oops.
go ahead, Nico, go ahead.
Oh, okay, I was just going to say something. So far, we've been kind of more or less focused on academic setting for some of this learning experience. But I want to compliment the South Dakota Humanities Council for actually creating an incubator for learning with this brainstorming series. And most recently, I was talking to a couple of people, and it boils down to the fact that we get into a topic that is complex. We have an hour to share what we can to take that beyond the hour experience. And I was posing, and along with another person, posing the question of how do we network this kind of public learning? This is taking the classroom experience outside of that box setting and allowing people to bring their own life experiences into a learning process. We also have, at this point in our history, we're looking at evolution of our humanity through technology. The evolution is also very clumsy and awkward because there's a lack of manners and etiquette with some of this very short responses, and it's misinterpreted for people who were pretty much drummed into this idea that you interact with other humans using etiquette and some rules of manner. So I wanted to make that comment regarding a public learning incubator and wondering what potential there is for this to develop a more sociogram type of spread for this to happen, because the land grant university has pretty much put a footprint in the possibility for that future experience for communities. Just wondering how that could happen.
Yep. And it is interesting. So technology, right, is a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, it's come so far, allows us to have, virtual meetings, virtual conversations. But you're right, people feel more anonymous. People don't have the same sense of personal connection, and so behavior can deteriorate, language can deteriorate. On the other hand, the potential for reach, right? For people who are in rural communities or who may have physical limitations to their ability to, go out in public, are able to participate through technology and leveraging technology. And I think it will only get better. You know, one of the things I do research on is actually early 20th century, like 19 teens, 20s phenomenon called the People's House, or in the United States, it was often the Civic Center, the Community Center. And often these were in very small towns. And their whole purpose, really, there might be a shack, in a little Minnesota town, was to do exactly this kind of thing, was to bring speakers in or have a topic for a conversation, but to essentially foster culture and connection in quite rural settings but also in urban settings. You think about the YMCA and the YWCA, the settlement houses, to bring people together and to engage with ideas. And I do think technology is giving us an opportunity to do that again, in ways that perhaps had almost fallen by the wayside. And so maybe we're turning a corner, actually, to get to a point where instead of sort of technology undermining community, technology may start to reinforce or recreate community and strengthen those ties.
Maybe this is an opportunity for the brainstorming of South Dakota Humanities Council to connect with libraries across the state and have viewing of this particular kind of programming.
Well, it's available because we archive all of these on YouTube, and people can just put it on a TV, hook up a computer and put it on a screen, and they can listen and then have conversations afterwards. And we encourage it, that's why it's there, show up, these are very important opportunities, Laniko, and I'm glad you brought that up. These are very important opportunities, and that's at the core of why we do these programs, is to bring people to you like Dr. Sargeant, who are doing things, but people don't know about it. And they say, well, why don't we have this? Well, actually we have it, but we're not doing the best job at letting people know. We're winking at a pretty girl in the dark, as they say. So we need to do a better job. And we can always do a better job. And we hope that you will help us and the rest of our esteemed panel too. Put it out there, let people know, invite them to come to have this conversation. The WPA, as you mentioned it, Dr. Sargeant, the WPA, during that time, they constructed a lot of buildings for that purpose. They made buildings available in order to bring the communities together. And they said, okay, if you want one of these buildings, bring it. The International Vinegar Museum is housed in one of those buildings. And there's a little plaque outside on the wall talking about that. And I've been introduced to others around the state that was their point, So that brings us actually to about the end of our program today. There's lots more that we could talk about, and we hope that we will continue to talk about it, and maybe have Dr. Sargeant come back and grace us with more of her esteemed wisdom. That would be great. And Joshua too, because we could have a long conversation about language, and we should have a long conversation just about language, because there's so much more to it than just words. In fact, we find out that words are weak. They're not the best communicators, but it's what we have. And so we're using that. But Or at least that's what we're aware of. There are other ways we're communicating we may not be aware of. So I think language would be, that would be one of those subjects that we can explore. Thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you'll join us next week, same time, same station. Until then, adios.
Yeah.